The morning sun peeked through the tall buildings of Washington, D.C., as Karoline Leavitt stepped out of a black SUV. At 27, she was already the youngest White House press secretary, known for her calm but commanding presence. Today, though, she wasn't heading to a press briefing. She was attending a small but significant court hearing downtown, one involving claims of religious discrimination. By her side trotted Liberty, her golden retriever, wearing a blue service dog vest. Liberty wasn't just a companion. She was a trained medical service animal assigned to help Karoline manage anxiety and PTSD. Most people didn't know that side of her, and Karoline liked to keep it that way. As they entered the courthouse, heads turned. A few whispered to each other. A security guard paused when he saw the dog. "She's a medical service dog," Karoline explained, showing documentation. The guard nodded. "Go ahead." Inside the courtroom, Karoline took a seat near the front. Liberty settled quietly at her feet. The space was quiet. Wood-paneled walls, worn benches, and the distant clicking of a clerk's keyboard. At 9:03 a.m., Judge Ronald McAllister entered. Known for his rigid style and dislike of distractions, he scanned the room and paused briefly when he saw the dog. The trial began. A small business owner claimed the city had unfairly fined him for a religious display, a wooden cross in his shop window. Karoline took notes, her expression unreadable. Then McAllister spoke. "Miss Leavitt," he said, eyeing Liberty, "this court is not a place for animals." Karoline stood calmly. "She's a federally protected service dog." The judge narrowed his eyes. "Is that necessary in this setting?" Karoline didn't waver. "I wouldn't bring her if it wasn't." The room went still. That's when Liberty stood. No growl, no bark. Just a slow rise to her feet. Poised, focused, calm. The entire courtroom froze. Even the judge leaned back slightly, unsure what to say. Liberty's silent presence had just made the loudest statement in the room. For a moment, no one moved. Liberty stood beside Karoline, still and silent, but commanding. Her golden coat glimmered under the courtroom lights, her head held high. The room, which had been filled with quiet typing and shuffling papers, now felt frozen. Judge McAllister cleared his throat. "Control your animal, Miss Leavitt." Karoline replied evenly, "She is in complete control, Your Honor." His jaw tightened. "Why did it stand?" "She sensed tension," Karoline answered. "She's trained to detect stress, mine or others." The judge leaned forward. "This is a legal space, not a therapy room. You appear fine to me." A low murmur ran through the courtroom. Some heads turned toward Karoline, others toward the judge. Karoline remained standing, her voice steady. "Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, I'm not required to prove anything further." McAllister looked visibly annoyed. "Sit down. Let's proceed." Karoline returned to her seat. Liberty, without a word or command, sat as well, gracefully folding herself back into position beside Karoline's feet. The trial continued. The small business owner, Mr. Whitaker, spoke nervously about his store's religious display and how he was fined. He insisted that others had similar decorations and were never cited. Karoline took notes quietly, observing the growing tension not just between the sides, but in the judge's tone. He asked sharp questions, cut off answers. Something felt off. Midway through the testimony, the judge looked toward Karoline again. "You're here on behalf of the federal government, correct?" She nodded. "Yes, observing." "Then perhaps you'd like to explain how this falls under federal concern?" Karoline paused. He was baiting her, inviting her to make it political. She chose her words carefully. "Freedom of religion and disability rights are both federally protected. That's why I'm here. Nothing more." The judge scoffed, then returned to the case. But the air had changed again. People weren't just listening to the witness. They were watching Karoline and Liberty. Something about the quiet way they handled the judge's challenge had stirred something deeper. Not fear, but doubt. In the judge. And faith. In the silent strength now sitting in the front row. As the next witness approached the stand, the courtroom remained oddly tense. Judge McAllister shuffled papers, but his focus drifted. His gaze kept returning to Karoline, and to Liberty, who now lay quietly, her head resting on her front paws. She wasn't doing anything, but somehow her stillness felt more powerful than movement. The new witness, a city employee from code enforcement, began his testimony. He claimed that all signage fines were applied fairly, without targeting religious symbols. His voice was calm, but his body language told another story. Tapping fingers, shifting eyes, a voice that wavered under pressure. Karoline watched silently. Her pen scratched notes, her eyes narrowed. Liberty didn't move once. The defense attorney stood. "Can you confirm that no religious displays were targeted more than others?" he asked. The city worker hesitated. "I believe so." Karoline's pen paused. "You believe so?" the lawyer repeated. The judge cut in. "Move on." The witness answered. But people noticed. There was doubt now. Then the doors in the back opened quietly. An older woman stepped in, gray hair, glasses, a neat gray suit. She held a folder and moved straight to the clerk, whispering something. The clerk raised her eyebrows, then passed the folder to the defense team. McAllister frowned. "Who is that?" "Dorothy Kane, Your Honor," the defense said. "Retired city employee. She brought documentation related to internal enforcement memos." McAllister's voice sharpened. "She's not on the witness list." "She came forward voluntarily," the lawyer replied, "and what she's brought may prove critical." The judge's fingers tapped the bench. His face stiffened. "Proceed, then," he said, through gritted teeth. Mrs. Kane approached the front and spoke softly, but clearly. "I worked in the city's code department for 18 years. I brought internal emails showing that certain neighborhoods, mostly religious or immigrant communities, were quietly marked for stricter inspection." A shocked silence filled the room. Karoline didn't react outwardly, but inside she knew this moment mattered. McAllister tried to recover. "These documents are unverified. They're copies of emails I received directly," Mrs. Kane said. The judge glanced toward Karoline again. She wasn't speaking. But she didn't need to. Liberty slowly lifted her head. The courtroom was silent. All eyes were on the golden retriever again. She hadn't moved. She hadn't barked. She'd simply looked. And somehow, even that was enough to make the judge shift in his seat. The tension in the room lingered like smoke. Judge McAllister stared down at the folder Mrs. Kane had provided, but he didn't open it. His jaw clenched. His hands gripped the edges of the bench, and for the first time that morning, his voice wavered. "We'll set these materials aside until verification," he said. The defense lawyer pushed back. "Respectfully, Your Honor, this testimony and the attached documents could shift the entire case. They deserve immediate review." The judge didn't answer. In the gallery, whispers stirred. Some reporters began typing rapidly. A staffer from a senator's office leaned forward, listening closely. Karoline sat in perfect stillness, but she noticed everything. The tremor in McAllister's hand, the slight flush in his face, the way he now avoided her eyes. Liberty sat calmly at her side, watching the room, sensing the collective change. And then, something subtle, but unmistakable. The judge glanced at Liberty. He didn't say a word, but his stare lingered, as if expecting the dog to react again. And when Liberty didn't move, it somehow unsettled him even more. McAllister cleared his throat and addressed the courtroom. This hearing is now in recess for 1 hour. Before anyone could speak, he banged the gavel and stood up, leaving the room with unspoken urgency. As people slowly rose from their seats, Karoline stayed still. Liberty remained seated, gaze fixed on the judge's bench. "She's shaken him," someone whispered behind her. Outside in the hallway, reporters gathered. Cameras clicked. Phones recorded. A journalist from a national outlet approached Karoline. "Do you think Judge McAllister is under pressure?" Karoline kept her voice steady. "I think the public is paying attention. That changes things." "Did you train your dog to stand like that as a signal?" Karoline looked at Liberty, then at the reporter. "She's trained to protect," she replied. "Sometimes that means doing nothing, and sometimes it means reminding people they're being watched." The quote spread quickly online. "She's trained to protect, even in silence." Liberty in court began trending nationwide. But Karoline wasn't thinking about hashtags. She was thinking about what came next, and how sometimes a courtroom doesn't need shouting to shake. Just one quiet witness. Who knows when to stand? The hallway outside courtroom 3B pulsed with noise. Reporters clustered in groups, whispering, recording voice memos, texting editors. The tension inside had spilled out, like water leaking through a crack in a dam. Karoline stood calmly near a column, Liberty resting at her feet. The golden retriever seemed unaware of the buzz, but Karoline knew she felt everything. Service dogs like Liberty didn't need words to understand pressure. They read the room better than most people. Mark, her communications advisor, approached with his phone out. "You're blowing up," he said. "Liberty in court is trending everywhere. Fox, CNN, even the Independents. People are watching this case now." Karoline didn't even glance at the screen. "Let them watch. That's the point." A few reporters began to approach. One held out a mic. "Miss Leavitt, do you believe Judge McAllister called recess to avoid more scrutiny?" Karoline kept her voice measured. "I believe public attention changes how power behaves." Another reporter stepped forward. "Was Liberty's behavior planned? Some online think it was staged." Karoline finally looked up. "Liberty is a trained medical service animal. She doesn't perform. She protects." The quote spread instantly. "She doesn't perform. She protects." It appeared within minutes on news tickers and political blogs. Even neutral observers online began posting screenshots of Liberty standing. Her calm posture had become a symbol of control, of quiet resistance. She didn't bark. She didn't growl. She just stood. Inside the courtroom, a new energy stirred as people returned to their seats. Even aides from congressional offices had now shown up to observe. What started as a minor zoning case had evolved into something larger. Karoline entered the courtroom last, Liberty following closely. As they reached their seat, Liberty lay back down with quiet precision. The clerk announced the judge's return. McAllister stepped in, visibly more composed, but different. He looked tired. The kind of tired that comes from public pressure, from knowing your next words might echo far beyond the courtroom walls. Karoline remained still. Liberty didn't move. But everyone could feel it. The balance of power had shifted. Judge McAllister returned to the bench with a faint stiffness in his step. His expression tried to project control, but anyone paying attention could see it. something had changed. He tapped the gavel once. "This court is back in session." The defense attorney stood immediately. "Your Honor, in light of the testimony from Mrs. Kane and the materials presented, we respectfully request a judicial review and the inclusion of this evidence into the formal record." The judge hesitated. "The court has not yet verified the documents." "The witness has offered to submit sworn testimony," the lawyer pressed. "Her affidavit is included." McAllister glanced down at the folder again but didn't touch it. Instead, he exhaled. "This court will note the request," he said, "but no decisions will be made until full review." He turned to move the hearing forward, but the defense wasn't finished. "We also request that Miss Leavitt be called to the stand. As the federal observer present, her input may provide valuable context regarding constitutional protections." The judge flinched, visibly. He looked at Karoline. "Do you wish to testify?" Karoline stood, calm and composed. "I have no objection, Your Honor." Liberty remained in place as Karoline stepped toward the witness box. She moved without hesitation, each footstep echoing against the courtroom floor. No one spoke. Even the reporters sat completely still, pens frozen in midair. After being sworn in, Karoline folded her hands on her lap. "State your name and role for the record." "Karoline Leavitt, White House Press Secretary. Here as a designated observer." "What have you observed?" the lawyer asked. Karoline's eyes remained steady. "I've observed patterns of selective enforcement. I've observed emotional escalation from the bench. And I've observed the public reacting, not to volume, but to silence." The judge's face hardened. Karoline continued. "When my service dog stood, it wasn't to disrupt. It was to reflect the discomfort that already existed in this room." She responded honestly. Some people struggle when honesty is quiet. Murmurs rose in the gallery. McAllister tapped the gavel lightly. "Enough." But it wasn't enough. Not anymore. The moment Liberty stood, this became more than a local case. And now that Karoline had spoken, the silence had a voice. One that couldn't be dismissed. Karoline's words still echoed as she returned to her seat. The courtroom was completely still, except for the scratch of a pen, the distant buzz of a phone on silent, and Liberty's slow breath as she settled once more at Karoline's feet. Judge McAllister looked like a man under a microscope. His gavel rested on the bench, untouched. He stared at his notes, but everyone could tell. He wasn't reading them. The defense attorney rose again. "Your Honor, we respectfully renew our request for judicial review. This is no longer a zoning issue. This is about fairness, consistency, and potential bias." There was no objection from the city's lawyer. McAllister blinked slowly. Then, something unexpected happened. He stood. "I need a moment," he said. No gavel, no formality. He simply stepped away from the bench and disappeared behind the door to his chambers. The courtroom buzzed instantly. What just happened? Did he walk out? Can a judge even do that? Karoline remained quiet. Liberty lifted her head slightly, sensing the shift. Reporters scrambled to get messages out. Assistants huddled with legal counsel. Even the bailiff looked unsure. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. Finally, the judge returned. But he wasn't wearing his robe. He approached the front with slow, deliberate steps, holding a folded piece of paper. "I'm recusing myself from this case," he said. Gasps filled the room. "The events of the last day have brought to light questions about my ability to remain neutral. Effective immediately, Judge Dana Renner will take over proceedings." The clerk was stunned. So was the gallery. The room wasn't built for moments like this, sudden admissions, quick exits. But here it was. McAllister looked at Karoline as he gathered his things. "I misjudged the moment," he said, not loud, but clear. Karoline met his eyes, not with triumph, but with silence. Liberty, now sitting tall once again, watched as the judge exited. She didn't move. She didn't need to. The message had already been delivered. The courthouse steps were crowded by the time Karoline emerged. Cameras clicked. Reporters called her name. Staffers from both sides of the aisle watched from the sidewalk, whispering to one another, phones in hand. The judge's recusal had already made headlines. Karoline didn't speak. She simply walked forward, calm, composed. Liberty beside her, each step steady and sure. Mark caught up as they neared the car. "You flipped the system without raising your voice." Karoline opened the door and looked down at Liberty. "I didn't flip anything," she said. "I just didn't back down." That quote would end up everywhere. I didn't back down. By the time she returned to her office, the internet had exploded. Hashtags like Nomiman, Liberty in Court, and Stand in Silence trended across platforms. Conservative media praised her poise. Liberal commentators, some reluctantly, admitted her silence had spoken louder than any argument. But Karoline wasn't chasing headlines. She was reading the Ethics Board report. Within 48 hours, the Judicial Council had launched a broader inquiry into courtroom practices and ADA compliance. Several other judges were now under review. Change was moving, faster than expected. And Liberty? She was resting near Karoline's desk, head tucked under one paw, peaceful. 2 weeks later, Karoline was invited to speak at a legal forum on constitutional protections. Instead of delivering a fiery speech, she told a simple story about a courtroom, a judge, and a dog who stood when it mattered. "No one expected Liberty to stand," she said. "But sometimes the strongest act of resistance is not loud. It's calm, it's silent, and it cannot be ignored." The room gave a standing ovation. Back at the White House, President Trump passed her in the hallway. "Heard you gave the courtroom a lesson they won't forget," he said with a grin. Karoline smiled back, but said nothing. She didn't need to. In that moment, everyone knew. She had reshaped a conversation about power, prejudice, and presence, not with noise, but with one silent witness, who knew exactly when to rise. In a world where shouting often drowns out listening, one woman and her dog proved that strength doesn't always need volume. Karoline Leavitt didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She didn't point fingers. She stood silently, and Liberty stood with her. This wasn't just about a courtroom or a judge. It was about presence, about dignity, about knowing when to act and when to let stillness speak. In that quiet moment, something powerful happened. A golden retriever rose, not to threaten, not to perform, but to remind everyone watching that justice has eyes, ears, and sometimes 4 paws. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of truth. So the next time you feel ignored, underestimated, or overlooked, remember this: you don't always need to shout to be heard. Sometimes all it takes is the courage to stand. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And tell us in the comments, when was the last time you stood your ground? Not with words, but with presence. At Brano Stories, we believe that quiet moments can change the world, one story at a time.